The first time I heard my husband's voice after he died, I thought he was playing a prank on me from the other side. Because it wasn't a memory or a dream, no. It was his real voice, dry, bossy, alive, coming out of a cassette hidden behind the living room outlet. The sound was almost ridiculous. A click, a dull thud against the floor, and suddenly that smell of old dust, of warm plastic. My grandson Nick had stuck his finger where he shouldn't, like every grandkid who survives their grandma's lectures trying to plug in his new charger. I just told him, "Be careful, that wall is older than you, and democracy put together." And right then, the outlet cover came loose and the tapes fell like coins from a treacherous pocket. 3, 4, 5, all with the same handwriting that froze my blood. January 2001, Manny. My husband, Manny, 20 years dead and still making noise. Nick looked at me with a video game face. "What's this, Yaya?" I, without blinking, "Evidence, honey?" But I don't know of what yet. I don't know what came over me, but I went straight to the closet, took out my old Walkman, yes, the one I kept for nostalgia, blew off the dust and slid in the first tape. The sound was rough, like the house breathing after years. And there he was, my husband, my dead man. "Manny Sanders, pleasure to meet you. Don't worry, this stays between us." And another voice on the other end, nervous, almost crying. "Please, Don Manuel, I'll pay next month. I swear." And my husband, calm, in that way he used to sound friendly while sinking you. "Relax, man. But I don't want delays. You know Mrs. Julia trusts you too." Silence. And then, my laugh. My own laugh recorded, trembling, as if I were being forced to celebrate something I didn't understand. I slammed the Walkman off. My heart was pounding like a hammer. I didn't remember laughing like that, or being there, or consenting to anything. And yet, that was my voice. I had been in that room. And the worst part, I'd kept quiet. Outside, it was raining in fury. The living room was in semi-darkness, only the floor lamp on. Nick kept staring at the tapes as if they were time capsules. "What's wrong, Yaya?" "Nothing, love," I lied. "Your grandpa is still a pain." And then Daniel, my eldest, came in with his jacket soaked and that air of, "I'm here to check, Mom hasn't fallen apart yet." "What are you doing with that?" he asked, pointing at the Walkman. "Listening to family oral history." "And is that yours or Dad's?" "Both, it seems." I hit play without warning. Manny's voice filled the living room again. The tone was kind, but with that arrogance you only notice once you no longer love. "I can help you, but remember favors have a price." Daniel went pale. "Turn that off, Mum. Dad would never record anyone." I looked at him without blinking. "Well, he's answering you from the living room." I don't remember crying, but I do remember the heat rising in my face. Suddenly, that house where we'd raised the kids felt like a black box, full of voices I never wanted to hear. And I thought, what if my whole married life was this? A bad recording, with background noise and edited silences. I gathered the tapes and stacked them on the table. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, each with a date and a number. On the 5th, in blue marker, there was a name, Mason. It rang a bell, but I didn't know from where. And there, between the rain and the tick-tock of the clock, I felt something like a stab of shame mixed with hunger. Not for food, for truth. To know what the hell my husband had done with those people. And what I had done, by action or omission. So I got up, went to the kitchen, flicked on the neon light, and poured myself a coffee strong enough to raise the dead, and I told myself, "Julia, you're going to listen to every one of those damned tapes. Even if your ears bleed, you kept quiet 20 years. Today, it's time for noise." Before I continue my story, I'm really curious to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to read you in the comments, really. Because if I learned anything, it's that secrets rot in silence, but shared they hurt less. That night, while Nick slept and Daniel watched me from the doorway with that mix of love and fear, I put on the second tape. The sound of rewinding clawed at my nerves. A doorbell, footsteps, a different voice. Greg says, "Sign, Manny." Greg, that name hit me like a blow. He wasn't just any neighbor, he was a local bus Agnesman. And if Greg was on my husband's tapes, then my house wasn't just a house. It was a trap, a power board. I turned the Walkman off slowly. I looked at the 5 tapes and knew what had started as my grandson's curiosity was going to turn into a dangerous excavation, and that if I pulled the thread, I wouldn't find peace, but fire. The next day dawned with a sour smell of damp and reheated coffee. I slept little or not at all. I spent the night staring at the tapes as if they were sleeping animals that could wake up at any moment. Around 8, Nick appeared in the kitchen with his school backpack hanging off one shoulder and a conspiratorial face. "Yaya, I didn't dream anything last night, but I woke up thinking about the outlet," he said. "Same thing happens to me with your grandpa." I answered, and an almost bitter smile escaped me. "Go on, eat breakfast before the world gets cold on you." When he left, I was alone with the radio on and the curtains half open. The news talked about an urban renewal project in my neighborhood. They said revitalization, modernization, sustainable tourism. Clean words that usually mean someone's going to make a killing. I turned off the radio and thought about the name on the tape, Mason. That surname sounded closer and closer, as if I'd been told it 1,000 times in some meeting I didn't know how to listen to. Mid-morning, Tiana came by, Nick's friend, a slim, smart girl with those huge headphones that look like Martian antennae. She offered to help me digitize the tapes to preserve them better. I let her, not because I trusted her, but because I wanted to see what someone young saw in that voice from another time. We put the first tape in a player she brought and connected it to the laptop with a cable that looked like an umbilical cord. While the sound crackled, I took notes in my squared notebook, the same as always, with my tight handwriting. Dates, names, background noises, a truck passing, a doorbell, the time announced by a radio host. Each detail was a small clue. Tiana watched, fascinated, as if she'd found an archaeological treasure. "Your grandpa recorded on analog tape, but the quality is good," she said. "You can tell he knew what he was doing." "Yes, he knew many things," I answered without looking at her. "Some I don't even want to know." On the 3rd recording, we heard a woman's voice. It was shaky, and she kept repeating, "I didn't want to, really." It was Manny who insisted. My heart lurched. I turned the player off and sat in silence for a long while, until Tiana dared to ask, "Is that woman someone you knew?" "Not yet," I said, "but I'm sure she lives closer than I imagine." In the afternoon, the doorbell rang. I opened, and there was Rose, one of the former tenants, the nurse who always brought sweets at Christmas. Her eyes were red, and her coat wrinkled. "I heard you found things of Manny's," she said bluntly. I didn't ask how she'd found out. In this neighborhood, the walls have mouths. She walked in without being invited and sat across from me with her hands clasped, like in confession. "He asked me for a favor," she whispered. "Said if I helped him with some hospital paperwork, he'd forgive a month's rent. I did it, Julia. I didn't think it was anything bad, until one day he asked me for another, and I got tired. And after? After he got angry, changed my lock. I had to move in a hurry. I kept quiet. There were too many loose pieces, and they all smelled the same, of manipulation, of small but poisonous power." Rose looked at me with a mix of guilt and relief, as if confessing to the widow lifted a weight. When she left, I kept listening. On another tape, a different male voice, rougher, said, "Greg says sign, Manny." And my husband's voice answered, tense. Without that confident tone I knew, I already signed. But I'm not going to keep doing it if they find out. That sentence burned my ears. Greg. Mason. Words starting to fit into a puzzle I hadn't asked to assemble. And behind it, a find out that sounded like a threat. That night, before sleeping, I sat looking out the living room window. The rain fell slowly, as if measuring my thoughts. I remembered the day Manny brought those tapes home for the first time, saying they were recordings of the tenants to avoid trouble. I didn't want to know more, because back then, my way of surviving was to look the other way and make dinner. Now that habit of cowardice, so comfortable, so domestic, embarrassed me. I poured a glass of cheap wine, raised it like a toast, and murmured, "To you, Manny, to the mess I'm about to dig up." At that moment, my landline rang, the one nobody uses anymore. I picked up and no one spoke on the other end. Just a thick silence, held breath. I hung up and waited a few seconds. The phone rang again. "Who is it?" I asked in a steady voice. Nothing. Just a click, and then the deadline tone. And that's when I knew someone, besides me, was also listening to the tapes. 2 days went by, and the phone stayed mute, but the silence was different. It was the silence of someone watching you from a corner you can't see. I kept on with my notebook, the tapes in a cookie tin, and a feeling of electricity under my skin. Around 8 in the evening, when the sky turned metallic gray, the building association president, Nick, knocked on my door with her usual sharp knock, 3 taps that sounded like inspection. "Julia, I don't know if you heard, but there's an urgent meeting in the foyer tonight. It's about the refurbishment," she said without meeting my eyes. I put on my coat and went down with her, knowing nothing good ever comes of the word refurbishment in a neighborhood where nobody has money to paint their nails. In the foyer, the bulbs flickered and the air smelled of dust and cheap cologne. Almost all the neighbors were there, even some who never came down. In the center, on a folding table, a projector threw the blueprint of our building onto a yellowed wall. In front of everyone, standing, a man in a dark suit with a miracle salesman's smile. It was Greg Lowe, the local bus Agnesman, the same name I'd heard on the tape, and beside him, in a light shirt with a city council pin on his lapel, Councilman Alvin Mason. My stomach slammed shut like a door. Greg spoke with theatrical enthusiasm. "Dear neighbors, this building has history, but also potential. We're going to modernize it, add value. New elevators, new facade, energy efficiency. And of course, those who want to sell will sell very well. We have investors ready." The words fell like coins on the floor, shiny and noisy. Mason nodded and smiled, waving to familiar faces. I watched him without blinking, trying to imagine at what point his name had crossed with my husband's. When they saw me, Greg lowered his voice a notch and feigned cordiality. "Doña Julia, you're an important part of the building. We value your opinion." His line sounded so false I almost laughed. "Didn't know widows mattered to you now," I said, with a smile that knew poison. He stepped close enough so only I could hear. "Your husband was a practical man, Julia. Don't destroy what he built." I froze. He didn't mean it as praise, he meant it as a warning. In a corner, Nick spoke with the younger neighbors, who were licking their lips at the idea of selling. "They're paying well, Nick. It's now or never," they said. The older ones looked at the floor, because we know that when money comes in through the door, history goes out the window. Then I raised my hand, slowly, like in an old school class. "I want to see the contracts my husband signed with you. If you have them, of course. Before we vote on anything, I want to know exactly what we're approving." Greg feigned surprise. "Of course, naturally, total transparency." Mason came up to me with that political smile that shagness without lighting anything. He handed me a card. "Here you go, Doña Julia. I'm at your disposal. If you need to review documents, I'll gladly help." I flipped it out of curiosity. On the back, there was a blurry photocopy of an old document. I went speechless. It was my handwriting, my clumsy handwriting from more than 20 years ago. An authorization with my name and signature. I didn't remember ever signing that. I felt a brief wave of dis-Agnes, like the floor tilted. "Where did you get this?" I asked. Mason kept the smile. "You gave it to me long ago. At a meeting, maybe. Papers repeat themselves, you know." I put the card in my pocket carefully, like you'd put away a sleeping snake. The meeting went on votes, murmurs, promises. I got them to postpone the decision a week. I said I wanted to read, compare, think. Nobody argues with a stubborn widow. At the end, Nick came up to me in the elevator. "Julia, did you know that Greg from before?" I looked at the fogged mirror. Let's say I've heard him more times than I would have liked. That night, I struggled to breathe. I made tea, opened the Walkman, and played another tape. Manny's voice sounded different, tighter, without his commanding tone. "I can't go on, Greg. I already signed what you asked, but I'm not covering any more." In the background, heavy breathing and then a thud, like a fist on a table. I turned the device off and sat with the cup in my hand, shaking. Manny had played with fire, and Greg was still there, flesh and blood, smiling, buying my house in pieces. I looked out the window. The neighborhood lights looked like watchful eyes. In the street, a black car stopped in front of the building for a long minute. No one got out. Then it pulled away, unhurried. A shiver ran through me. I sat and wrote in my notebook. Mason, Greg, fake papers, my signature. Manny recorded to protect himself, or to obey. Find out. I didn't sleep. Sometimes fear doesn't scream. It just sits next to you and breathes on your neck. The next morning I woke with a moral hangover, the kind that doesn't come from wine, but from truth seeping under doors. It was a gray, soft day, the kind of sky that promises neither anything good nor rain, just that Sunday silence that leaves you alone with yourself. I turned on the radio so I wouldn't hear my thoughts, then turned it off at once. They were talking again about the neighborhood refurbishment plan and the wonders of Councilman Mason. The same man who'd appeared on my tapes and now came on the radio as the neighborhood savior. I put on my coat and went for a walk, because staying home felt like breathing inside the same sin. I went to the old part of the neighborhood, where the facades still keep the colors of the 70s and the little shops survive more out of habit than customers. I stepped into a cafe that smelled of toast and fresh coffee and ordered a cortado. While I waited, I opened the notebook where I'd written all the names and dates and landed on one I hadn't wanted to look at too much. Hector. It was written in capitals, with a stroke so hard it had pressed through the page. I didn't remember writing it like that, but I had. Probably the night I heard his voice tremble on one of the tapes. That voice wouldn't leave my head. So I asked at the counter on pure intuition, like someone tossing a coin. "Do you remember a kid named Hector who lived around here years ago? Worked at a motorcycle shop, I think." The waitress raised her eyebrows. "Hector Allen? The one who died. Of course. His sister still lives 2 streets over, number 12. She takes care of their mother, poor thing." I left the bar with the coffee still hot in my hands and a new kind of tremor in my legs. I walked to the building she'd mentioned. Number 12 was an old building, rusty buzzer, and a doormat that said "Welcome" with sarcasm. I rang and waited. A woman opened, gray hair and tired eyes. "Laura Allen?" I asked. She nodded cautiously. "I'm Julia Martine, wife of Manny Sanders." My husband's name changed her face, as if I'd struck her invisibly. "Right. Come in," she said after a tense silence. The apartment smelled of bleach and soup. On the wall, a framed photo of a young man with a motorcycle helmet. Hector. I sat where she indicated, and before I could think better of my words, I told the truth. "I've found tapes where my husband talked with your brother. And what I heard? Well, I think Hector was being pressured by him." Laura went still, only moved her head slowly, and in that movement there were more years than words. "Doesn't surprise me," she said at last. "Hector told me he owed money, and Mr. Sanders was squeezing him, but I never knew how far it went. When he died, everyone said it was an accident. I never believed it." The silence that followed was heavy. On the table, there was a half-cold cup of tea and a rosary she was using as a nerve. "I don't want revenge, Julia," she added softly, "but I want someone to say his name out loud and say he wasn't crazy. That would be enough." I nodded, a knot in my throat. "I'll say it, and I'll stand by it, Laura, even if it costs me what's left of my peace." Before I left, she gave me an old folder with crumpled papers. They're his shop bills. "Maybe you'll find something there." I don't want to open them again. When I got home, I spread the documents out on the living room table, and there, among numbers and grease stains, I found a power bill dated the very day he died. The time matched one of Manny's recordings. I played that tape. Engine sounds, a car door, and my husband's voice, barely audible. "Don't do this to me, Hector. Don't leave me hanging." Then a thud, heavy breathing, and the tape ended. My heart pounded as if it wanted to escape my chest. I checked old bank accounts I still kept in a metal file. There it was, a cash deposit, no concept, the day after Hector died. Not a fortune, but enough to look like hush money. The doorbell startled me. It was Nick again, with that half-curious, half-worried face. I called earlier, but you didn't answer. They've come by to drop off papers from the council. They say they want to inspect the whole building. I stared at her. And who dropped them off? A young guy, in a suit. He had a folder with the urban planning seal. I put the papers away, which looked like photocopies of generic notices, and when Nick left, I checked them under the lamp. There were too many coincidences. The tapes, the names, the meeting, and now, the official visits. I sat, closed my eyes a moment, and listened to the distant traffic. I pictured Hector in his shop, wiping grease from his hands, promising to pay a small debt that ended up being his ruin. My chest hurt. Not just for him, but for me, for having lived with the man who might have pulled the trigger on that misfortune. That night I didn't want to play more tapes. I just looked at my husband's photo on the shelf, the wooden frame that had always felt warm and now made me cold. I spoke to him softly, because in the end, widows keep talking to the dead even when we know they don't answer. What did you do, Manny? Who were you really serving? I got no answer, only the hallway clock's tick-tock. I turned off the lights and went to bed with Hector's folder on my lap, like a crooked Bible. As sleep started to take me, I could swear I heard a car stop under my window, engine idling for a minute, just like that other night. I didn't dare look out. I closed my eyes and repeated Hector's name until it became a murmur. Because when a name starts to hurt, it means the truth is already awake and walking toward you. The next morning I woke with heavy eyelids, my body full of that strange stillness that comes after crying without tears. The day broke overcast, a thin wind banging the shutters against the wall. I put water on and turned on the radio to fill the silence, but turned it off at once. Mason again, his pleasant voice talking about urban revitalization and shared progress. That word, progress, already made me gag. I didn't know whether I hated him more or the tone with which he pronounced my neighborhood as if it were a real estate opportunity. I took out the notebook, the tapes, and Hector's folder. I spread everything over the table, a futile attempt to impose order on chaos. The evidence was there, but I didn't know how to give it shape or who to go to without getting crushed by the same system that had protected my husband for so many years. Then I remembered a journalist who once interviewed Nick about a water issue, a young woman with an old, wise gaze. Her name was Agnes Carter. She worked for a local paper that still prints on Sundays. I looked her up online and called her. She answered quickly, her voice clear, unadorned. Mrs. Julia, your surname rings a bell. Sanders? Manny Sanders, the guy from the building on Calle Real? I swallowed. The same. But he's no longer here to answer questions. We met at a cafe downtown, the one with big windows and mismatched cups. She arrived on time, with a digital recorder and a notepad. I didn't let her turn anything on until I'd finished talking. I told her the essentials, the tapes, the blackmail, the deaths, the forged papers, the names that kept repeating. Agnes listened without interrupting, with that focus only journalists who still believe telling the truth matters can manage. When I finished, she went silent for a moment, looking out the window. If what you say is true, this can shake more than a building, Julia. But I need proofs I can publish without getting the paper shut down the next day. I slid her one of the digitized recordings Tiana had made, the one with Greg pressuring Manny, and the clip of Mason's voice. Listen and tell me if it sounds like progress. She played it on her laptop with headphones, and when it ended, she looked at me with a mix of surprise and respect. This is strong, but I can't use it yet. It's private material. I'll need a lawyer to set the limits for us. I nodded. I have one. Her name's Sonia Vance. She's good and she doesn't owe me favors. We agreed to meet the three of us that same afternoon at Sonia's office, a tidy place that smelled of new paper and coffee. Sonia listened to the summary, reviewed my notes and the recordings, and said firmly, "There are things here we can use if backed by documents or if the affected parties consent." The rest is disclosure of secrets, and they could sue you. Agnes leaned toward me. Then let's do it right, Julia. We can prepare a controlled publication with legal proof and your testimony. But we'll do it when you decide. I don't know why I trusted them. Maybe because they looked at me, as if I still had something to say before they turned me off for good. We agreed Agnes wouldn't publish anything until I authorized it, and that meanwhile we'd gather solid evidence. For the first time in a long time, I felt part of something that wasn't just guilt. I left the office with a sweet vertigo. Evening was falling outside, and the streetlights cast an orange glow on the puddles. I walked to the market to buy bread, and at the door someone called my name. A male voice, low, unfamiliar. Doña Julia. I turned. A man around 40, in a suit, slicked back hair, handed me a folder. This comes from the council. Information about the refurbishment. You have 7 days to respond. I took the folder, and before I could ask anything, he was gone. At home, I opened the envelope. It was a generic notice, but at the end of the letter, in handwriting, someone had written, "Stop stirring up the past. No signature." I stared at that phrase like it was a small knife. It wasn't just any warning, it was an order. And that made me smile, even if out of rage. Nobody threatens an old lady unless they're afraid. I turned on the TV for noise and saw Mason inaugurating an urban art exhibition surrounded by cameras and smiling neighbors. He said, with that voice that now felt obscene, "Our neighborhood has a future. Thanks to the commitment of its families, it will soon be a place to be proud of." I switched the TV off in one blow. The screen's reflection gave me back my face with a mixture of fury and fatigue. I thought of Hector, of Laura, of Rose, of all those who'd been pushed into silence by the same people now talking about pride. That night I ate some cold soup, went over the tapes again, and marked one with a red label. That was the one I planned to show Sonia and Agnes. Before going to bed, my landline rang again. I picked up with my heart in my throat. This time someone spoke. A distorted male voice said slowly, "If you play that, you go down with them." Then he hung up. I stayed still, receiver in hand, listening to the repeated dead tone. For a moment, fear tried to climb my throat, but I stopped it with a simple, fierce thought. If they were already threatening me, it meant I'd started making real noise. And at 70, fear weighs less than shame. I spent the whole night tossing and turning, without sleep. With every turn I heard the metallic phone voice in my head, "You go down with them." That phrase stuck in my chest like a splinter, and not out of fear, but for what it implied. Because the "with them" didn't just mean Greg or Mason, it meant Manny too. It made me writhe to think his name still dragged mine like a long shadow, and that shadow had learned to talk to me on the phone. At dawn, I made strong coffee and headed to Sonia's office. The air was cold, smelled of fresh bread and damp gasoline. I walked slowly, my notebook pressed to my chest as if I were carrying a living animal that needed warmth. When I arrived, she greeted me with the calm of someone who's seen too many legal wars. On the table she'd spread several documents, copies of old contracts, property records, notes in her neat hand. She sat me down and handed me a folder. "I reviewed your husband's papers. There are irregularities in 3 signatures, Julia. The dates don't match, and the powers of attorney are from different days. If that's confirmed, any assignment made on the building could be challenged." I listened in silence, trying to get my head to follow my heart's rhythm. "And what does that mean, Sonia?" In words an old woman with high blood pressure can understand. She barely smiled. "It means you can stop Greg and Mason's project if you file for an injunction. But it also means you're going to kick up dust that doesn't sweep away easily." As we spoke, I started to notice a buzzing in my left ear and a sort of pressure in my chest. I put my hand on my fiver, heart, more out of habit than alarm, and Sonia stood at once. "Are you okay?" I nodded with a clumsy smile. "Don't worry. It's just age reminding me I'm not immortal." She gave me a glass of water and asked me to breathe slowly. After a few minutes, the dizziness passed, and with it the shame of feeling fragile just when I most needed to look strong. Then Whitaker came in, the retired notary she'd called to review the signatures. A man with a thin mustache and ink-stained fingers, who looked like he'd lived among papers so long he smelled of them. He sat and placed a magnifier over the documents. "Look here," he said, pointing at my supposed signature on a transfer contract. "This handwriting isn't yours. The stroke is too sure. At this age, pardon me, the hand trembles a bit more. And here it doesn't tremble at all. Someone younger signed this, or someone very practiced at imitating." Sonia looked at him with a mix of surprise and relief. "That's enough to request a notarial review. We can summon Mason and Greg, but first, we need to secure the evidence." Whitaker nodded, tucking the copies into a thick folder. "If you allow me, Mrs. Julia, I'll write the report myself. But a warning, when you touch a fake paper, the ghosts wake up." When I left the office, I felt a strange mix of lightness and fear. I walked to the park across from the market and sat on a bench. Children ran, pigeons fought over crumbs, and I wondered how so much normality could keep existing while my life was coming unstitched. I took out my phone and called Daniel. I told him calmly about the notary, the fake signatures, the contracts. There was a long silence on the other end. "Mum, please, stop. You're going to destroy what little good is left of Dad's memory. If someone forged something, it was surely an administrative mistake." I laughed, without joy. "A mistake, Daniel? Signatures don't forge themselves. And if it was a mistake, let them correct it in court." I heard him sigh. "You don't realize you're stirring up old crap. They'll laugh at you, Mum. I'd rather they laugh than silence me. Dad wasn't a criminal. Your father wasn't, but his silence was." He hung up without saying goodbye, and I stared at the phone with a bitter stab. I didn't blame him. Everyone defends themselves from ghosts as they can. I walked home slowly, letting the cool air clear my head. In the mailbox, there was an envelope with no return address. Inside, a single page typed, "Put the tapes back where they were." No signature, no address. Just that cold order. I tore it up and tossed the pieces in the sink, letting the water carry each letter down the drain. That night, calmer, I played a tape I hadn't yet heard. The sound was low, with background noise, like it was recorded in a room with an open window. I recognized Manny's voice, tired, almost defeated. "I can't keep this up, Greg. You're asking too much." And then another voice, deep, the bus Agnesman's. "It's too late to chicken out, Manny. Either you keep going, or you go with them." After that, silence and a door slam. I turned the player off with trembling hands. I thought about what Whitaker had said, about ghosts waking when you touch a fake paper. Maybe Manny signed more than he wanted, and the price was his fear. I made an infusion, sat by the window, and stared at the neighborhood lights. For the first time, I didn't feel guilt, but something like compassion. For him, for me, for everyone who'd taken part in that theater of power and cowardice. Before bed, I wrote a single sentence in my notebook. Tomorrow, I start moving the pieces. Because I understood the game was already on, and although my hands shook, I could still play my last match. The next morning dawned clear, with sun slipping through the blinds and falling on the table where I'd left the notary's papers and the recorder. I hadn't slept much, but that light gave me a kind of new energy, as if my body knew I'd passed the fear phase and entered combat. I made coffee and opened the windows to air out, letting the cold air sweep away the old night smell. While the pot burbled, I put on another tape, almost by instinct, and as soon as Greg's voice filled the room, I knew this one was different from all the others. It was a conversation with no intermediaries, just him and Manny, and the tone wasn't threatening, it was hierarchical. "This comes from above," Greg said. "Don't ask more, just sign what I send and keep the copies. If anyone asks, say it was by City Hall order." My husband's voice was hoarse, tired. "And if they catch me?" Greg laughed. "Then we'll say you did it by mistake. The mistakes of useful men are always forgiven." I stood still, cup in hand, watching the steam rise slowly. That tape changed everything. Manny wasn't just an accomplice, he'd been used. It didn't excuse him, but it explained the fear in his recordings. You could hear a soccer match in the background, and at the end an announcer shouted a score. I noted the date, the score, and decided to look up the broadcast. I wanted to know exactly when that had been recorded. I called Tiana. She and Nick came with her laptop and the kind of excitement that reminded me the young still think truth is a game you can win. Tiana opened a radio archive site and searched for the match. Look, it was a Wednesday in May 2003, at 11:20 at night. That meant Greg and Manny's meetings weren't old or innocent. They were part of a machine that had been running for years. Tiana, fascinated, added, "We could use the ambient sound to date all the tapes so we can prove they're not manipulated." I looked at her with a gratitude I didn't say. That girl saw patterns where I only saw shadows. That afternoon, Daniel showed up unannounced. His face was gaunt, and he had an envelope in his hand. He left it on the table without a word. "I found it in Dad's storage," he said. Inside were copies of contracts, wire receipts, a notebook in Manny's handwriting. "I didn't want to believe you, Mum, but this..." He didn't finish. I walked over and touched his arm. "It's not about believing me, Daniel. It's about understanding the kind of web they built and how it trapped your father." He sat, ran his hands over his face and murmured, "Dad was afraid too." I didn't see it. I played him the tape from that morning. He listened in silence, unmoving, until it ended. So Greg pressed him to sign and Mason covered him. I nodded. "Exactly. Your father was the bridge between the money and the legal facade." He looked at me with a mix of anger and sorrow. "And what are you going to do with all this?" What he should have done, speak, even if my voice shakes. Tiana, who hadn't stopped typing, looked up. "There's something else, Julia. I found a company with Mason's name and another person whose initials match Greg's. They're linked to an account abroad. Look, the tax address is the same as on this receipt from your husband." She showed me. It was a pass-through account, in the name of a company that existed only on paper. That detail was the key. A vertigo rose in me that wasn't fear, but the adrenaline of knowing the truth was about to show its head. "We need to give this to Sonia and Agnes," I said. Daniel nodded, though he looked like he wanted to hide under the table. "I'll call them," he muttered. The landline rang again, like a warning echo. The three of us stared at it without moving. I let it ring until it got tired. I didn't need more threats. I was already in open war. At dusk, when Nick and Tiana left, Daniel and I sat in silence. He looked at the stacked tapes and said without raising his eyes, "I never thought my father was afraid of anyone. I always saw him so sure, so in control." I sat across from him. "Men like your father aren't born brave, Daniel. They just learn to fake it. Until someone takes their script away." That night I wrote in my notebook, "The executioner had an executioner too." I felt something like compassion, but also a cruel clarity. Manny had been both cog and victim, but I had been the house where the machinery hid. And now it was on me to dismantle it, even if I cut my hands in the attempt. Shortly before bed, I got a voicemail, a nervous female voice, almost whispering, "I'm a city employee. Don't say my name. I know about the building file. They didn't destroy it. They want to use it against you. If you can, meet me at the archive tomorrow at 5. I deleted the message and stayed still, phone still in hand. The fear came back, but it was a different fear, clean, the kind you feel before crossing a border. I knew that the next day, when I walked out holding that notebook to my chest, nothing would be the same again. Because every step toward the truth, in my neighborhood, costs a bit less peace and a bit more dignity. I was punctual, though I wasn't sure what I was going for or what I expected to hear. At 4:45, I was already at the municipal archive door, an old building that smelled of varnished wood and old dust, the kind where every step echoes like someone is following you. I had the notebook in my bag, a pen and a small recorder, just in case. Outside, the sky was overcast, and people walked fast, hunched, not looking at each other, as if the wind carried more than leaves. Inside, a woman with chestnut hair and deep circles under her eyes greeted me, dressed discreetly, in a gray coat that looked too big for her. She didn't give me her name, just said, "This way, quickly, I don't want anyone seeing us talking. We walked through narrow aisles to a room of metal cabinets that squealed when opened. There, she handed me a thin folder, stamped with the city seal. "This should never have left here," she whispered. "But the original file for your building wasn't destroyed, like they said. They swapped it for a forged copy. The original has your husband's signatures, and also Mason's and Greg's. And most important, the date. They brought the dead Agnes forward to include the building in the refurbishment plan before it could be declared community heritage. That's illegal, but no one checked." I stared at the folder like it had a bomb inside. "And why give it to me?" I asked. She lowered her gaze. "Because I'm tired of working for people who think they own everything. I was there when the papers were switched. I saw it. But if I speak officially, I'm out. If you make noise, maybe something changes." I thanked her without touching her, afraid of leaving her marked on my side. "Don't worry," I said. "I won't mention your name. I don't want to drag anyone else into this mire." I tucked the folder under my coat and walked out slowly. Outside, late afternoon had turned dark blue, and the wind lifted papers off the ground. I took the bus home with my heart pounding like a hammer. On the bus, I opened the folder discreetly and saw the seals, signatures, dates. Everything matched what Sonia suspected. Manny had signed under pressure. Greg and Mason had moved the dates forward, and that maneuver allowed their company to buy rights to the building at a ridiculous price. All of it with papers that looked legal. When I got home, I called Sonia and Agnes. I asked them to come. Agnes brought a young sound tech she knew from the paper, a 20-something kid in a wrinkled t-shirt with an alert look. "He can help clean the tapes, improve the audio quality," she explained. We spread everything out on the living room table. Tapes, copies, the original file. The kid connected his computer, turned up the volume, and started tweaking frequencies. Suddenly, a background noise got clearer. You could clearly hear a woman's voice whispering, "Alvin," with a tone of confidence that wasn't professional. Agnes lifted her head. "That's the urban planning clerk, I'm sure. She shows up in several photos with Mason." I turned the audio off. "I don't want to use her name. If we expose her, they'll destroy her. I want the papers, not fresh blood." Sonia nodded. "We can use the content without revealing identities. We just need material proof. With this and the notary's statement, a judge can grant an injunction." We spent hours reviewing, organizing, making copies. Agnes took frantic notes. The kid handled the files like playing an instrument, and I watched with the sense of being in the middle of a scene that didn't entirely belong to me. At times I felt pride, at times a tiredness that ran down my legs. When they were leaving, the doorbell rang. I opened without thinking, and there in the doorway was Greg. He wore his impeccable suit and that polite smile that sounds like a threat. "Good evening, Julia," he said, tilting his head slightly. "I see you've been receiving lots of visitors lately. Lawyers, journalists, young people with laptops. Strange, isn't it?" I stood in the threshold, not letting him in. "Not strange. It's a social life. What do you want?" His smile widened a notch. "Nothing. Just remind you that stirring the past sometimes brings up unpleasant smells, and some things are forgotten for a reason." I didn't answer. I just closed the door in his face. He didn't move. He put his hand on the frame and said, "It's not personal, Julia. It's Bus Agnes. And Bus Agnes always gets settled one way or another." I slid the deadbolt and looked him in the eye. "I am personal, Greg, and I've got nothing to sell you." Then I pushed the door until I heard the click. That night I could hardly sleep. Every building noise sounded like a footstep. At 2 a.m, I turned on the lamp and opened the file again, going over seals, signatures, names. I noticed that among the papers there was a copy of a meeting minutes dated the very day of Hector's accident. On the list of attendees was my husband. A chill ran through me. If he was there, then his alibi was false. Maybe that meeting wasn't a coincidence, but part of the blackmail that pushed him to the edge. I wrote it all in my notebook with a firm hand. Original file, meeting on the day of the accident, minutes signed by Manny, Greg, and Mason. Purpose: Closing agreements. I shut the notebook and breathed deep. I knew that the next day I'd go to Sonia's with those documents and ask her to file the legal motion. I couldn't turn back. I looked out the window before bed. The street was empty, but a shadow moved in front of the building, and for a few seconds I was certain I was being watched. I closed the curtains, turned off the light, and got into bed. I felt my heart strong, fast but not with fear, with anger. I wasn't a victim, not again. This time silence wouldn't be my defense, but their sentence. By dawn I had no sleep or patience left. Everything in me asked for movement. The night had left me with a strange clarity, as if my mind had washed itself while my body surrendered. At 8, I was in Sonia's office with the file under my arm and the notebook open, full of crooked notes, dates that looked like wounds. She greeted me with coffee in hand and a tired face. "It's ready," she said. "We're filing the injunction today and requesting preservation of all Greg's and Mason's accounting records. With this and the tapes, we've got more than noise. We've got a pattern." I sat across from her and breathed slowly. "Do it, Sonia. If it scares me, it's because it matters." That same afternoon, Agnes called me. "Julia, I need to see you. They've confirmed the councilman's event for tonight. He's presenting his new housing program. It'll be at the neighborhood civic center, and neighbors are invited. I think you should come." She said it in a measured voice, but I understood the message underneath. It was the perfect stage to expose the truth. I hesitated a second. I don't like spectacle. I never have. But I saw my reflection in the office window and knew silence no longer served me. "I'll be there," I answered. And when I hung up, I felt something inside settle, like a piece finally clicking into place. The civic center filled up before dusk. The white stage lights made the officials' suits shine, and the floor gleamed with that artificial polish you get at events where promises are made that will never be kept. Mason spoke fluently, smiling, thanking neighbors, throwing out words like progress, participation, and future. I watched him from the third row, coat buttoned to my neck, hands in my pockets, holding the little player I'd brought. Agnes was at the table, moderating, and when our eyes met, she gave me a small nod. Suddenly Mason started talking about the refurbishment of my building. He said it was the perfect example of collective effort, that its recovery was thanks to everyone's collaboration. I felt my blood ignite. I stood without thinking. "Excuse me, Mr. Councilman," I said aloud, and the room's murmur stopped. Agnes intervened, surprised but steady. "The floor goes to Mrs. Julia Martine, neighbor of the building in question." I walked to the microphone. The air grew heavy. "I didn't come to talk about progress," I said. "I came to talk about what you call collaboration. Because no one asked me anything when you forged my signature, or when you blackmailed my husband, or when you bought my house for crumbs. But you do call me neighbor when there are cameras." Mason tried to interrupt, smiling, with that paternal gesture of a confident politician. "Mrs. Julia, I understand your concern, but there are legal processes that—" I didn't let him finish. I took the recorder from my pocket and placed it on the lectern. "Then let's listen to a legal process," I said, and pressed play. Mason's voice filled the room. "It's too late to chicken out, Manny. Either you keep going or you go with them." The echo thudded against the walls. There was a hard silence, like a hit of air. In the front row, some neighbors stood. Others looked at each other, confused. Mason went pale, his hands searching for something invisible in the air. Agnes spoke then, firm. "The recording has been authenticated by an independent expert and is part of an ongoing court file." Sonia, who was at the back, raised a document. "And the court has admitted the injunction today. The building won't be touched until the signature forgery is investigated." The murmur turned to noise, then to shouts. Mason tried to recover his composure, but there was no speech left to hold him. At that moment I saw Daniel, standing in the aisle, looking at me with a mix of fear and pride. He approached slowly, came up on stage and, without looking at me, spoke into the mic. "I'm the son of Manny Sanders. My father recorded all of that." I don't know how much good or bad he did, but I know he was afraid. And I don't want to keep quiet. I found one more tape, the last one, and I want it to be heard. He took a small tape from his pocket and handed it to the event's sound tech, and after a few seconds, Manny's voice filled the room again. It sounded weaker, more human. Julia, if you ever hear this, forgive me. I got into something I don't know how to stop. I wanted to protect you, but I don't know from whom anymore. Nobody spoke, only the mic's hum and the held breath of everyone there. When the tape ended, Mason wasn't smiling anymore. Inspector Vale, who had arrived among the crowd without me noticing, came up to the stage and said firmly, "Mr. Mason, I need you to come with me. There are proceedings underway." The councilman tried to protest, but the crowd's murmur drowned him out. The whole room seemed to beat. I stepped outside while the Civic Center lights stayed bright. The cold hit my face and I breathed deep. Daniel caught up to me outside. "Mum, you did it." I shook my head. "No, son, we did. You and I and even your father, wherever he is. He left the evidence. I just made it play." We hugged without another word. Sirens sounded in the distance. I didn't know if they were for Mason or for Greg, or if the world was just going on with its usual noise. But for the first time in many years, I felt I could walk upright without fearing my house's echoes. As I headed back to my building, the rain began to fall slowly, and each drop on the pavement sounded like a period. The next morning dawned clear, with a different kind of silence, the kind that doesn't weigh but rests. I woke before the alarm, with a dry throat and an aching body, like I'd run a marathon in my sleep. On the radio, they spoke about the arrest of a councilman for alleged document forgery and bribery, without names. But there was no need. The whole neighborhood knew who it was. There were messages on my answering machine from people who hadn't spoken to me in years, some to congratulate, others to pry, and one, an unknown voice that only said, "Not everyone was guilty. Mrs. Julia." Some were afraid too. I deleted it without thinking. I no longer wanted ghosts leaving notes. Late morning, Daniel came by. He came in without knocking, with dark circles but a new calm. In his hand he carried the tape he'd played at the event. "I couldn't sleep," he said. I listened again. "Dad sounds sorry." I asked him to leave it on the table. "That tape isn't his defense, son. It's his goodbye." We sat facing the open window. The air brought the smell of warm bread from the corner bakery and wet earth. The moment I thought of all the times I dreamed of this same silence without knowing it would feel like this. Neither relief nor sadness, just a kind of honest stillness. Marta came later with her son and a bag of pastries. "I heard the news. Are you okay, Mum?" I nodded. She hugged Daniel and me, and for the first time in years the three of us were together without arguing. Nick played with the tapes, lining them up like dominoes. "Yaya, are you going to throw them away?" he asked. I smiled at him. "No, honey. I'm going to keep them. But not to hide them. To remember what mustn't be repeated." In the afternoon, I went with Sonia to the courthouse. We signed the last papers for the donation. The money left in the building's account and the back rent would go to a psychological support association in the name of Hector Allen. When we came out, the sun was dropping slow and golden over the streets. "This doesn't erase anything," I said. "No, but it balances the scale a bit," Sonia replied. We walked in silence to the corner, where I said goodbye with a long hug. I walked home, slowly, stopping at every familiar shopfront, every door I'd once thought of selling. The building looked different. The walls lighter, the windows open. Nick waited for me in the foyer with a folder under her arm. "Julia, I've called everyone. We're going to vote." We went up to the community room, where the neighbors spoke in low voices. On the table, the boutique project plans were wrinkled, coffee-stained. "We propose staying," Nick said, "doing the rehab ourselves, without selling our souls to anyone." We voted one by one. Yes, won by a majority. Someone clapped, and then everyone did, like they didn't know what to do with the emotion. After, I stayed alone a while in the foyer, looking at the stairs, hearing the echo of my steps from other years. I thought of Manny, how everything he touched had twisted, but also how, in the end, his own voice had been the rope that pulled the truth to the surface. I couldn't hate him entirely. Part of me still loved him, if only out of habit. I took the old photo Laura had given me of her brother from my pocket and put it in an envelope, along with a receipt in my handwriting, the one proving the money he paid before he died. I went to her place, rang, and when she opened, I handed it to her. "This is yours too," I said. She didn't hug me or cry, she just nodded. "Now he can rest," she murmured. I came back as night fell. The house was dim, only the living room lamp on. On the table lay the stacked tapes and the Walkman. I poured myself a glass of wine, put on the tape Daniel had brought, and sat by the open window. I listened to Manny's voice again, trembling, more human than ever. "If you ever get to this, Julia, don't hate me." I tried to fix it and didn't know how. I looked at the neighborhood lights, the curtains moving in the breeze, and I understood forgiveness wasn't absolution, but a period you write so you can turn the page. I turned the recorder off slowly, and the click rang soft, clean. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't scare me. I felt the house breathing with me, without secrets, without echoes. I stood, flung the window wide open, and let the air come in smelling of bread, of new life. I thought of Hector, of Laura, of Rose, of all those who were small pieces of a dirty story that finally had light. I sat again and allowed myself a smile. I thought that, maybe, justice doesn't always arrive in court. Sometimes it arrives in the form of an older woman who dares to say her name out loud. And as night fell over the neighborhood, I whispered the last sentence I had left to say, the one I'd kept for years without knowing it. I turned the recorder off, and at last, my house listened to me. And well, that's my story. If you've made it to the end, thank you for joining me on this journey full of noise, silence, and truth. I'd love to know what you think. Did it remind you of someone? Have you ever kept a secret for too long? Tell me below. I want to read you. And if you liked this story, subscribe and turn on notifications, because what's coming, you won't want to hear it from the beginning, you'll want to live it with me. See you in the next confession.